A radiant god ran full tilt through a sunlit wood, his arms flung wide to seize the girl fleeing just ahead of him, and his hands closed, not on warm living skin, but on rough bark and the sudden burst of green leaves. This is the myth behind the laurel crown, the wreath that has honored poets, victors, and emperors for 2,000 years. And it begins not with love at all, but with a god's wounded pride. It began, as so many disasters do, with pride. The young god Apollo had just killed the great serpent Python, the earth-born dragon of Delphi, and he was insufferable with the glory of it. He had emptied almost his whole quiver into the monster's coils until it lay dead beneath the cliffs and the whole country breathed again. And now he walked the world swollen with his own triumph. And so, still glowing with conceit, he came upon little Eros, the love god, the smallest of all the gods, bending a bow of his own and carefully fitting a string to it. Apollo could not let it pass. He stopped, looked down, and sneered. "What are you doing with a warrior's weapons, boy? A great bow like that belongs across my shoulders, not slung on a child's back." I laid the monstrous python low beneath a whole cloud of arrows. Be content to kindle your little love fires with your torch, and leave the real weapons to a god who knows how to use them. And Eros, the smallest of all the gods, looked up at him, entirely unafraid. "Your bow may strike every other thing, Apollo," he said very quietly, "but my bow will strike you. And by as much as every living creature is less than a god, by exactly that much is your glory less than mine." Then he beat the air with his wings and rose into the sky. He came to rest on the cold, shadowed peak of Parnassus and drew from his quiver 2 arrows. Arrows of 2 opposite makings, forged of different metals for 2 opposite ends. One was tipped with bright, sharp gold and glittered at its point, and that arrow kindled love wherever it struck. The other was blunt and dull and heavy with lead, and that one drove love away. The leaden arrow he loosed down into the huntress-nymph named Daphne, and the golden one he drove clean through Apollo, through the bone and deep into the very marrow of him. And in that single instant, everything was decided. The god caught fire with a helpless, consuming love, and the girl in the very same breath was armored against love forever. It was a perfect, symmetrical cruelty. The same small archer, mocked and vengeful, had lit an unquenchable fire in one heart and frozen the other solid, and aimed the 2 of them straight at each other. For this was Daphne, a wild young huntress, and the daughter of the river god Peneus, whose bright cold waters wound through the green vale of Tempe. She wanted no part of what Apollo now felt. She lived like the goddess Artemis. She adored her hair loose and careless, wanting no husband and no marriage, nothing but the deep woods and the long chase and her own fierce freedom. Her father, growing old, longed for grandchildren and told her so, again and again. "You owe me a son-in-law, daughter," he would say. "You owe me grandchildren to hold before I fade." But the very thought of a wedding was hateful to her, like a kind of crime. She threw her arms around his neck. "Dearest father, let me stay unmarried forever." Artemis's own father granted her as much. And Peneus, loving her, gave in, though he warned her, gently and sadly, that her own beauty would never let her keep the quiet freedom she was asking him for. And he was right. For at that very moment Apollo first saw her across a forest glade, and the golden arrow did its cruel work, and the god was utterly undone. He loved her the instant he looked. And here was the cruelty of it. The god of prophecy, who could read every future in all the world, was completely blind to his own. He gazed at her wild, careless hair and imagined it dressed, at her eyes bright as stars, at her lips, her fingers, her bare arms, and he longed for far more than only to look at her. But she was already running, swifter than the light spring wind. She fled from him, and she would not stop, would not even slow for a single word he threw after her. "Nymph, daughter of Peneus. Wait, I beg you," he called after her. "I am no enemy hunting you down. The lamb flees the wolf like this. but I chase you only because I love you. Do you even know who it is you flee? I am no rough herdsman. Zeus is my father. Through me the future is revealed. Through me the lyre strings sing. I am the god of healing. And yet love is the one wound no herb of mine can ever heal. But the terrified girl was already gone, running for her very life. And so helpless, the god began to run too. And now came the chase. And it was a terrible thing to watch, to tell it. The old poet reached for the cruelest picture he knew, a hunting hound and a hare. Picture a lean hound loosed on an open plain. The instant he sights a hare, the dog straining with everything he has after the catch, and the hare straining just as hard after her very life. The hound is certain, at every single stride, that now at last he has her, his open muzzle stretched out over her heels, sure the next bound will close his jaws upon her. And the hare is never once sure she is not already taken, twisting away, snatched out of the very teeth, leaving the snapping, disappointed mouth to close on the empty air behind her. So they ran, the god and the girl, across the world. He made swift by his hope, and she made swift by her fear. But of the two of them, hope is always the faster, for he was borne up on the beating wings of his love, and he gave her no rest at all. He ran at her very shoulder, close and constant as her own shadow. He breathed hot on the hair that streamed loose across her neck. She could feel him there, just behind her, and now at last her strength began to fail. Her knees weakened, her breath tore in her throat, the color drained from her face. She had run herself to the very edge of what her body could bear, and still the god was gaining on her. Worn out and white with terror from that headlong flight, she lifted her eyes, and there, ahead, through the last of the trees, she saw the bright moving waters of her father's river. With the very last of her strength, she reached its banks, and threw out her arms toward the water, and cried aloud to the one power left in the world that might still save her. Father, help me. If your rivers truly hold any divine power, then take it from me. Destroy this beauty of mine that has pleased a God too well. Change it, change me, take it all away. She had barely finished the desperate prayer when it was answered. A heavy, creeping stiffness came flooding over all her limbs, rooting her fast where she stood at the water's edge. A thin skin of bark began to close over her soft breast. Her long, loose hair lengthened and darkened, and started strand by strand to turn into green laurel leaves. Her arms, still reaching, grew upward and outward into slender branches. Her swift feet, so fast a moment before, sank down and took root in the earth, and could no longer move at all. And a rising canopy of green swallowed her upturned face. Nothing at all of the girl was left but her own shining beauty, become, now, only the soft gleam of a tree. She had become the very first laurel. She had escaped the god at last, but she had done it at the unthinkable cost of her own body and of her own human life. And even now, even after all of it, even as a tree, Apollo loved her still. He came running up to the fresh young laurel, stricken, and could not believe what he saw. He pressed his open hand flat against the trunk, and there, beneath the thin, new-made bark, he could feel it still, her heart faint and frightened, going on beating beneath the wood. He threw his arms around the branches as though they were still her shoulders, still her body, and he pressed his mouth to the wood and kissed it, again and again and again. And even then, even as a tree, the wood shrank back and drew away from his kisses. Even now, even with nothing human left of her, she still flinched from his touch. "Since you cannot be my wife," the god said to her at last, quietly, "then, at the very least, you shall be my tree. I claim you still. You will be mine after all. Laurel, from this day on, my hair will always wear you. My lyre will wear you. My quiver will wear you. Wherever Apollo goes, your green leaves will go with him. You will crown the poets and the victors of the games. You will ride at the head of the great generals in their triumphs, down all the long ages that are still to come. And just as my own head is forever young and my bright hair is never cut, so you too shall wear the unfading honor of your green leaves forever. And the laurel tree, as if it were listening, bent its new-made branches low, and seemed to nod its slender leafy crown, dipping it gently, like a bowed head answering yes. Or perhaps, the poet is careful to say, perhaps it was only the evening wind moving in the leaves. He tells us that it nodded, and then he leaves it hanging, and never says which. And that is the story as it has come down to us, lovely and sorrowful, and painted 1,000 times over the god, the fleeing nymph, and the birth of the crown of honor itself. But look again closely at what the old poet actually set down on the page, and the loveliness of the picture slowly turns cold and strange and hard in your hands. Because Daphne never loved him, not for a single instant. She never could have loved him. The blunt gray lead arrow had made quite certain of that from the very start. Every last moment of her story was fear and flight, and a final desperate prayer to be unmade, dissolved, turned to wood, anything at all rather than be caught by him. This is not, then, the tragedy of a great love that failed. It is something colder than that. The tragedy of a powerful desire that simply would not be refused the thing it wanted. It is a God so utterly certain of his own worth and beauty that he could not even imagine that his wanting her was not, all by itself, a rightful claim upon her body. A God who heard a young woman's absolute, terrified no, and heard in it nothing at all but a head start, a game to be won, an obstacle to be run down and overcome. And who, when at last she escaped him the only way she still could, at the cost of her very life and body, even then, even so, would still not simply let her go, but held the rough bark against him, and kissed the wood that flinched from his mouth, and broke off her living leaves, and wound them into a crown and set it on his own bright head. The version we all know is the Roman poet Ovid's, the 2 arrows, the pleading speech, the desperate chase. Older Greek tellings shape the very same tale quite differently, with no Cupid in it at all. And her name, Daphne, was never anything more than the ordinary Greek word for the laurel tree itself. The whole shining story grew up, in the end, only to explain a name. So the most honored crown in all the Western world, the laurel of poets and champions and kings, began its life as a frightened girl who chose to become a tree rather than be caught by a god. And the myth has never once, in 2,000 years, quite decided which of the two of them we are meant to mourn, the shining god who lost her, or the girl who finally got away. Some stories are truly about love. This one only wears love as its mask. And so beautiful and terrible and unresolved, the great age of gods and mortals goes on. Thank you for watching. If this tale stayed with you, subscribe. A new myth arrives every week, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Until then, may the old stories keep their hold on you.